Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Greg McCormick, Director of the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge. Today's webinar is number 5 in our series of webinars where we bring you Georgia Tech professors and researchers to discuss ideas and topics in smart communities and the related policy, technology, and innovation ideas supporting our move toward a technology-driven digital future. We'll be hosting 4 additional webinars this year on a variety of topics. The dates of those webinars are available on our website, and those dates are October 23rd, November 14th, January 24th, and April 14th, all at noon. If you've joined our subscriber list and receive our monthly e-newsletter, you will receive invitations and reminders to those future webinars. And if you'd like to subscribe to the Georgia Smart newsletter, you can do so from the bottom of our website homepage, which is located at smartcities.ipat.gov.edu/Georgia-smart. I've also made that link available in the chat area of Blue Jeans today for your reference. Before we get started, a few housekeeping remarks to eliminate interruptions. Is being recorded and will be available on the Georgia Smart website for viewing. The slides will also be available for download from our website. We will be answering questions at the conclusion of the presentation. So please use the chat area to submit your written questions. We will answer them in the order we receive them after the presentation has concluded. So without further delay, we're very excited to have with us today Dr. Chris Dantec, Associate Professor in the Digital Media Program in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication here at Georgia Tech. His research is focused on the areas of digital civics and technology for community engagement. Chris's presentation today is titled Designing the Infrastructure of Digital Civics. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Greg. I'm very happy to visit at Georgia to talk about digital civics and some of the research programs and projects that I've been involved with recently to give you an idea about what is going on. So I see the audio is cutting out. Has it gotten better? We'll try to debug any of these problems as we go. Okay, I will keep going. Please do let me know via the chat window if something isn't working, if you can't hear me, or if I've dropped out for some period of time, and I will come back. So as Greg gave you a sense of my research, I'm really interested in understanding how people and technology come together in cities to create the kinds of places that they want to live in. So as I would kind of describe very broadly, my research integrates empirical, design-based, and theoretical investigations of technology use in civic contexts. My main area of interest is this intersection of design and technology and public engagement, and it underlies this emerging area of research that I call digital civics. And really, what does this all mean, though? In short, it means very simply that I work with communities to design technologies and processes that enable civic participation. And different projects have different kinds of emphases or different focuses. So sometimes I'm really focused on innovation within computing, right? Specifically the kinds of systems that people might use to collect data, to interpret or analyze data, and really focus on that technology piece. And other times the projects are really focused on the social or organizational change that takes place around new technologies, whether that's in a community setting or whether that's set within the context of local or municipal government. The shared principle through all of my research is that the work is directed through close collaboration with partners, that meaningful civic participation starts with working to resolve meaningful local issues, and this is really a fundamental principle or fundamental component of digital civics. So throughout today's talk, I'll be referring to this term digital civics, and you might not have encountered it before. And really what it is it's the bringing together of two areas. So it's the mix of smart cities and digital democracy. And the smart city, as I think we know, is really this idea of a city where sensing and services are analyzed, and they come together in our urban lives to create greater efficiency, to improve customer service, to improve our public institutions, to make better use of limited resources, whether those are tax dollars or the kinds of resources that you would have in a community, be those physical or human. The other side of that is digital democracy, where technology helps mediate civic engagement and creates avenues for direct governance, and is really tied to this idea of broadening access. So with digital democracy, the emphasis has often been, how do we use technology to make it easier for people to engage with civic processes, whether they're able to meet in person or not? Across both of these areas is this idea, or kind of these two concepts that simmer kind of equally, are really data and participation. Right? And I'll talk about each in turn as I set some of these things up. And the first is to really think about data. Right? And you might wonder, why am I using a slide of a beach to talk about data? And the reason is that as I think of data, particularly as it relates to the smart city, data is to the smart city as sand is to the beach. Right? It is the material that makes the thing happen. And just as sand at a beach might provide a range of experiences, from being something that you're able to play with and enjoy, to something that maybe you are unhappy with having gotten into the creases of your bathing suit or into the depths of your beach bag. Data in the smart city is very similar in that we might put it to good use, but it also might be the kind of thing that chafes us or that needs to be attended to and cleaned up when moved from one place to the next. Now, if we think about data as sand, and we think about the kinds of promises of the smart city, then what we get is this idea of the city composed of data that is really idyllic, right? It is smarter, it is built of data, it is well ordered and integrated, and it creates this fantastical image of the future of our cities through the I won't even say judicious, but through the widespread application of data and data analysis. But I would argue, and I think many of you would probably share this experience, that the reality is more or perhaps less complicated, and that the reality of our smart cities today looks something more like this, right? It's a bunch of silos of data, right? Each is in proximity to the other, but they're not necessarily well integrated, right? Our transit data exists, but it doesn't necessarily connect with our parking data. It's certainly not linked to our zoning data or to utility data or to our crime data, but it's all there. And arguably, it's something there's an opportunity to do more integration and more analysis with, but it takes work. But I think more than that, it's also at risk of being washed away by the tide. Right? So at any given moment, a change in technology, right? Technology gets obsolete. There might be administrative turnover. There might be a change in vendor. All of these are the kinds of tides that wash away these very precarious sand castles that we're building out of the smart city. And so this is an opportunity to think really carefully about how do we use data as a material in crafting policy responses and developing the kinds of governance infrastructures that we need that respond to the people that we're serving. And this brings me to the second part of all of this, and that is participation. So along with data comes this idea of participation, and the idea of the smart city being a place where there are new and different ways to participate in local governance, in the creation and maintenance of the place that we live. And so just as cities are being reimagined by the production and application of data, how we act civically is also changing as a result of these same technologies. Right? Modes of communication between citizens and government are evolving. Right? So scenes like this, where someone comes to a public meeting and stands up at a microphone, they're still present, but they're not the only way that people participate publicly. Right? They're being shifted, right, to things that look more like this. Right? So here's an old screenshot of an interaction of Cory Booker with residents in his city, where there's a conversation about how to deal with really mundane problems like filling potholes. Right? And this might feel quaint given the rapid evolution of how elected officials have used Twitter, It is no longer necessarily this kind of conversation. But the point here is that Booker was using a mundane daily interaction between residents and local government as a way to solve city problems. Right? And so just as public services are being changed by the move to smart cities, so are the ways that we're participating with municipal authorities, which evolves our expectations of public services. Right? So reaching out to your elected officials through Twitter to get something done creates a whole set of new expectations around the responsiveness of a city. Right? That one, it's asynchronous. You don't have to be at the meeting anymore. It's at a time that is convenient to you as a resident. That it's personalized. Right? So your Twitter feed is kind of customized to your needs and desires. And interacting with government through that personal experience makes it feel much more intimate. And also that it's on demand, so that it's ready to respond to you as a resident when you have an issue. And these are very different kinds of expectations than often we think of when we are interacting with local government. Right? The timescales shift and the needs of residents become different in management. And so this is really what I mean when I think about digital civics and this idea of the material, the sand, that we work with, right? It's about these relationships, this interaction between computing and data and different forms of participation. To help make some of this more clear, I want to walk through two different research case studies that help highlight different elements of this relationship. Right? The first case study is focused on how the design and deployment of a technology intervention is informing different kinds of policy and community engagement. And then the second is really focused on the community engagement piece and how that becomes a guide for understanding how new technologies might be developed to mediate between different constituencies within the city. So because I'm at Georgia Tech and located in Atlanta, both of these projects are really centered on Atlanta, but I think many of the kinds of things that I'm talking about here are relevant to cities and communities across the state of Georgia, regardless of size and kind of capacity with technology that you may have historically had. So the first project that I want to talk about is a long-standing collaboration I've had with a colleague in civil and environmental engineering. Her name is Carrie Watkins. We've been running a project with the City of Atlanta, with the support of City of Atlanta and ARC for many years called Cycle Atlanta. So Cycle Atlanta was a project that had kind of two main interests. One was creating a new data source for planners working to increase the appeal of Atlanta's bike infrastructure. And with that, also creating new opportunities for public participation in the planning process that produced new bike infrastructure. So this twin goal of how do we create new data that helps planners understand something more about cycling, as well as how do we create new opportunities involved in that process, were really what drove and what continues to drive the Cycle Atlanta project as it evolves through different kinds of technologies. This started at the time, this was in 2012, with a simple smartphone app that we deployed. I always find some small joy in these kinds of screenshots because it also shows how rapidly our technology is evolving. At the time, this felt very state-of-the-art, but already now looks incredibly dated, especially as new devices have been announced in the last week that make it look much, much different today than it was even a few short years ago. But the project took this smartphone app as a way to figure out to document where people move through the city. And the idea was to use the kinds of habits that cyclists have in keeping track of where they ride and when, like Strava or Map My Ride, which are more fitness-oriented applications that help people who are interested in cycling as fitness keep track of where they've gone. This was launched in a very specific way to focus commuters, and with the goal made very clear that all the data collected was to be shared with the City of Atlanta planners as they are trying to understand where do people move through the city and what are the kinds of choices they make as they go from their origin to their destination. This builds on a crowdsourced model of collecting ride data that really fits within the smart cities mode where technology is used to instrument infrastructure in some cases, but in this case, we're instrumenting citizens to say, okay, where do you go, and tell us something about yourself so that we understand some of the criteria that might be going into why you make the choices you make. This also fits a little bit within the digital democracy mode, where citizens are advocating through the use of data. And I'll develop this a little bit more, but instead of going to the public meeting by producing these data for the purpose of informing planners, riders understood that this wasn't just for their own kind of fitness tracking, but was really meant to be a way to communicate with people who are making policy decisions about where to build cycling infrastructure. And the goal, of course, is to think about cycling as a mode of transportation and not just a mode of fitness or recreation. And so often when we think about cyclists through the city, this is the kind of rider that we encounter. This is the perfect example of what we refer to as a mammal. That's a middle-aged man in Lycra, and is not particularly the kind of rider that we need to focus on when we want to broaden the number of people who are choosing to use cycling as a viable mode of commuting or transportation within the city, right? No doubt these individuals will ride kind of no matter what, and certainly additional facilities on the road will help them. But the kinds of riders that we're most interested in trying to support, and the kinds of riders where there's the most, what we think of as latent demand, are cyclists that look more like this, right? So here's a woman who has her family on the back of her bike. So she's not going to want to ride in heavy traffic conditions. She's going to ride on protected bikeways and really make a different set of choices about where she goes, because her ability to go there when she's lugging around 100 pounds of bike and kid are very different than the cyclist who is just pushing himself to some fitness level. The thing that I would also point out, and I think it's worth pausing on, is that both of these images are of very dedicated cyclists. So the mammal in the previous slide is someone who is very dedicated to cycling as a mode of transportation and fitness, but so is this woman who has a very specialized bike that's able to hold 3 children on the back. So it's not about a kind of seriousness, but it's really about what are the kinds of decision points that feed into how people make choices of where to go. And the main challenge here, really fundamentally, is how do we get good data that informs where people are currently going? Traditionally, the mode is to do a kind of cycle census taking where you might place a person out at a key intersection and have them count the number of bikes that go by during known peak hours. And that's useful for getting a sense of throughput at a particular juncture, but it doesn't tell us anything about the choices people are making as they move through the city to either avoid certain kinds of geographies, like get around a big hill, or whether to avoid certain traffic conditions. And so to quickly just live respond to this question about using the Strava data, we have looked at the Strava data, and Strava sell their data to cities. This is another kind of element of smart cities, is that there are many data sets that you might purchase. There's a set of conditions that are different, though, and in comparing our data to the Strava data, we find that riders who are riding for the purpose of commuting make different choices in their routes than riders who are riding for fitness. And so it's the Strava data is a useful proxy, but we wanted to get more specific and to understand what is this other category of riders who are maybe not kind of riding for that fitness challenge. What are the choices they're making? So the data that we get looks something like this. So this is a map that has collected many of the rides, not all of the rides that were recorded through our app. And they're segmented based on rider type, which you can, I think, hopefully make out there on the right. So the red routes are the strong and fearless riders. These are your regardless of infrastructure. They're very confident riding in traffic. They don't feel the need to change where they're going based on the conditions around them, and may in fact choose more challenging conditions as part of the way that they identify and ride as a cyclist. And then looking down through, we have enthused and confident, and we have comfortable but cautious, and then interested but concerned. And each of those sets of riders represent a different level of confidence when riding in traffic. And you can start to see very clearly in the map that they make different choices of how to move through the city. So the big kind of fuzzy area to the right-ish part of the map, that's the Beltline, and it shows very clearly that everyone loves the Beltline. So those of you who may not be familiar with the Beltline in Atlanta, it's the growing that has been very popular. And so that East Side Trail that's seen here, it has done a lot of work to bring people through this connection area. But you also get a sense that the data are messy. So you see that some of the lines don't follow the street grid and jump around, as well as there are gaps in parts of the city that are not represented in the data. And these are all important things to focus on as we think about these kinds of data as a tool for informing how cycling infrastructure is approached and built out across the city. And looking at this in the context of urban planning, so we had an early version of that map present at a planning charrette, where planners and residents got together to talk about proposals for different bike infrastructure. And this was really an example of that crumbling sandcastle where we had this data, but the edifice of the data was constantly being washed away by the realities of working a public planning process. People would make arguments about a particular street showing that there was a lot of traffic on it, but then the counter argument might be that where it's not clear if that is a lot of different riders riding on the street or if that's a single rider who is going up and down that street repeatedly. And I think that's important to think through, because one of the challenges as we think about this marriage of data and participation is that if we have new ways of participating, then perhaps producing a lot of data about a thing that you care about becomes a kind of equivalence to showing up and shouting in the microphone at a public meeting and being present all the time. And so dismissing those moments of repetitive and intentional data production would be the same as trying to dismiss someone who is advocating strongly for something that they want. The other thing that we started to realize was that the data were taken seriously because they were produced through technical means, right? It came from a smartphone and GPS so that it couldn't be faked, right? Often when we do these kinds of design charrettes in a more kind of traditional way, one of the activities is to have people draw on a map. How do they normally commute? Where do they normally ride? And those moments are often subject to either misinterpretation or misremembering, or even idealizing a particular route. Like, that I would normally go this way, but actually, in fact, losing the detail that they take a detour to avoid a tricky situation. And so the fact that it came from a technical artifact, from a system, meant that people took the planners and the residents in the room took the data as being authoritative evidence of where people traveled. But there's that flexibility in how those authoritative data were used. Right? So in one sense, being able to make counterclaims that I don't believe a particular number of riders were riding up and down Peachtree. I think it was just one person trying to make it seem really bright, and that brightness would help persuade people to put bike infrastructure there, shows that the data is also a rhetorical tool. It's not just an objective measure. It's something that people use and mobilize in a way that they're able to make arguments about. And I think we can also look critically at this project as one that speaks to this idea or this agenda of broadening participation in policy generation and policy discussions, but it's not very intentional about thinking through the reality of who is participating. And we see this often through the kinds of data that's presented in the map. So the gaps and which neighborhoods are obviously present and which are not, and then the consequences of what that might mean for those neighborhoods as neighborhoods perhaps on the west side who are not actually participating in this data production. How does that fit within the way planners understand the transportation needs of those communities? Right? And I would argue that these elements, they matter in digital civics because they're not categories of bugs that should be worked out of the system, but they're key components to how digital civics enables smart cities to actively make urban centers smarter. It provides tools for people to engage and this shared civic imaginary that says, how do I advocate for the kind of city I want to live in? So these gaps in data, or the ambiguities in what the data might mean, are actually very useful footholds for residents to come together and say, let's move towards the kind of project or the kinds that matter most. And it becomes that focal point around which engagement can form and enable cities and enable citizens to look for opportunities to find new solutions. Right, so the implications that come out of this kind of project and focusing on what does it mean for participation and how does the data forward that participation. So first, it really helps us try to think through these questions of representations of data. Right, so cycling in this, the urban core of Atlanta is not. It's certainly becoming more common. As a cyclist myself, I will say there are more of us on the road in the middle of town than there used to be. But when you take all of the riders together over months of time and you compress that down into a single map, it really makes this community much more visible otherwise. And that these representations of cyclists on a map are the kinds of things that planners and city managers can really act on. So now that we know where people are, we can start to make some very specific decisions about what to do. And that these individual acts of collecting data really become a collective, visible representation of a certain kind of community that lives in the city. It also helps to present or articulate the different subjectivities that are present in data collection. So the conditions of data production, the conditions that lead into deciding to record your ride, really trace other kinds of contours and boundaries within the city. These include contours of race, of class, of identity, right? There's a whole set of things that are baked in and somewhat invisible in the way that these data are presented back. Right, so the data really only tell us about the people who identify as cyclists, and very specifically about the people who identify as cyclists and are willing to use their smartphone to record their ride, and very specifically about the people who identify as cyclists and are willing to use their smartphone to record where they ride so that they can give that data to the city to influence policy. Right, there are layers and layers of identity that are rolled into this, and really not much of a way to understand who is there and why they are there. And so what happens to the number of cyclists who are not willing to record their ride or who are nervous about sharing where they go for safety reasons? And so these are important things to consider when we think about the subjectivities of data and how people choose whether or not to participate. Right, and then finally, it's about the rhetoric of data. So how do we make arguments? And what are the kinds of arguments that we're able to make with the data that we have available? Again, this gets back to my metaphor of sand in the sandcastle. Depending on the kind of sand you have and how wet it is or how dry it is, changes the kind of structure that you might be able to build. And so in the same way, the kinds of data we have change the kinds of arguments that we might be able to make with it to produce the outcomes that we're looking for or to inform the policies that we're looking to inform. So the next project I want to talk about, and a shift, is to talk about the community engagement playbook. So this is the complementary side of my research that's not focused on kind of leading with technology, but is really focused on understanding the conditions or the context around digital interventions and how people and practices might use those digital interventions to achieve new outcomes. So this work follows a constellation of projects that began in 2012 in the historic west side of Atlanta. So these are the neighborhoods around the football stadium and to the west of Georgia Tech's campus. Right, and the genesis of this work was a project focused on developing new forms of community engagement and inviting in communities who are not always invited to design the futures in which they are asked to inhabit. Right, so working with low income residents to understand what are their needs, particularly in a neighborhood that has been distressed for decades, and how do they think about their own relationship to each other within their neighborhood, within the history of that neighborhood, and then using that as a platform to build a set of capacities around community engagement. So we began this work with the idea that community members have a chance to address specific issues that we had come to learn about in their community. Things that they cared about were, in some ways, the usual kinds of challenges: public safety, affordable housing, economic opportunity, and really thinking through how can digital technologies of various sorts help become a platform for sharing different kinds of information and for communicating across different community boundaries to come to some kind of collective understanding of what they might do to address those different issues. In the midst of all this, in 2014, the new stadium was announced. And so this project became an immediate focal point within the neighborhood and really started to shape the research project around ways to connect the work we were doing around community identity into a vehicle for, at the time, really resisting the stadium development plan. So there was a lot of fear in the neighborhood. There's a long history of stadia construction and broken promises in these neighborhoods. And so this was the context in which suddenly we had a focal point for understanding or for thinking about what does it mean to build community engagement and to what end. And so again, for those of you who may not be that familiar with this specific part of Atlanta, the 5 neighborhoods directly involved in the project really suffered decades of divestment and disenfranchisement and have created some of the most deeply distressed areas of Atlanta. Right? The slow erosion of these neighborhoods has led to the erosion of trust between residents in the city. And all of this really came to a boil as the stadium project was announced and negotiated and moved forward very rapidly. There were real breakdowns between community leaders and community groups and the city and the Falcons and the Blank Foundation and kind of all of the players around what does it mean to have a community benefits agreement? What would that entail? And how to move forward in a productive way that helps rebuild trust and also rebuild the lives of individuals in kind of areas adjacent to a large amount of public investment and how that circulates. So there's a lot of detail here that I won't go into, but the kind of the short version is that there were major breakdowns between the city and the residents of this neighborhood. And to the city's credit, following those breakdowns, they recognized they needed to rethink how they did community engagement. And so they applied for a grant from an organization called Living Cities, and it was a program that was run not unlike the way that we run the Georgia Smart Community Challenge program, and that a number of cities were selected as a cohort to think about community engagement in their own context. And it was an 18-month undertaking to understand the current engagement practices within the city of Atlanta, the experiences that residents of the 5 neighborhoods around the stadium had with engagement, and then to produce a guide, which we call the Community Engagement Playbook, that tries to distill a series of best practices and expectations that has 2 purposes. One is a set of plays that are directed at city organizations or city agencies to say, here's what is kind of expected of you in good engagement, and here are some best practices. And another which is directed at community organizations to talk about how do you build capacity so that when you are being engaged by the city, that you're able to meet them at that spot in the middle and make the most of those opportunities to have your voice heard and responded to. Right? As part of this 18-month process, the first step was to really map the landscape of who were the stakeholders and what was their history. Right? And we did this through a series of public events with well over 100 people in attendance and kind of design-like activities across tables to really think about and recognize that it's not always been great, and to be upfront and direct in the fact that we're here to really take stock of where things have fallen apart, but also to acknowledge where they've worked so that we can build on the things that were productive. The other part of it was to train a number of community residents to go interview city officials and city kind of operators at different levels to understand what do different departments mean when they talk about community engagement. So if you work in city planning, you have a series of ways that you think about community engagement and a number of different kinds of activities or approaches that you might use. Those are different than if you work in parks, and they're different than if you work in watershed management, right? And so all of these departments have, they use often similar words around engagement, but they mean very, very different things. And so by working with residents to understand and catalog what those different meanings were, we were able to do two things. And the first really kind of instrumentally is we've learned all of the different ways that the city of Atlanta engages with the public. But also, the residents themselves learned that firsthand. And so it was no longer a mystery, and it was no longer kind of an assumption of ill will, which often, kind of bad intentions often, I think, become assumed when things don't go the way you would like them to go. And they realized that there was a set of constraints that were often invisible to the public, despite the best efforts of the people involved to make things work. And so this became the foundation for then building out this community engagement playbook, where residents and city officials and members of the nonprofit community around that area work together to outline very clearly what are the principles of good engagement, and then what are the methods that help embody or help ensure that good engagement happens. And good engagement here is really about enabling opportunities for meaningful feedback and dialogue around issues. It's not about guaranteeing a particular outcome, but really about understanding that different parts of the city and different kinds of communities have different capacities for working with within official channels. And so being able to build up a set of conversations in one neighborhood may look very different in another neighborhood, but we need to have a shared understanding that this is what it means to do equitable engagement. Right, and so the playbook becomes a way of understanding what's possible in terms of the kinds of engagements that we might have, but it also becomes a kind of map for understanding the different touch points or intersections of civic encounters and where technology might in fact be useful or play an important role. And so as we look across different modes of engagement, there are ways to say, how do we do some of this in a process or in an organizational way, and then how do we do this in a way that leans into technology or into data to help with the communication or the decision-making program. Right? And the implications for this in terms of civic computing is really, again, this first one in terms of translating across different kinds of civic encounters. What does it mean to think through who gets to engage and when do they get to engage, and what are the expectations and obligations of that engagement? And being very clear about what that means and what a successful outcome looks like. I think really importantly, what this project also did was build capacities. And I think this is probably the most important piece, because it wasn't just about identifying maybe novelty or best practices in engagement, but it was about, on both sides, within the city and within the communities, building capacity to understand the processes and constraints of engagement in an official kind of municipal governance capacity, but also the needs and expectations that residents had when officials would come out into their neighborhoods and approach them. And so that joint understanding became a new kind of capacity to act within the civic system. And then finally, to think through the products, whether that's data displays or interactive systems or interfaces that help enable these different capacities and help facilitate these different encounters. So this brings me to the end, right back to our idyllic beach paradise and the social and technical infrastructures that enable digital civics. And in creating these infrastructures, there are really, I think, some productive tensions where, on the one hand, the tools of the smart city often presume empirical, objective, and dispassionate basis for upon which different kinds of policy decisions might be made. Right? If we have more data, we can make better choices. And yet, modes of democratic participation, digital or otherwise, they're messy, they're subjective, and they're perpetually contested. And so this tension between having kind of perfect knowledge about what to do and yet the need to let the public have an ability to contest those decisions is really where digital civics sits. And it's this reality of how do we move from data and how is it produced and where is it used and how is it argued about to get to the goals of good community engagement that we see in the community engagement playbook. And it's through this that I argue we need infrastructures of participation that really engage with this tension. Right? And I think this is an important part of the Georgia Smart Community Challenge as a useful way to think through the kinds of opportunities both for improved decision making and for new ways of community engagement in that process, whether you're looking at economic development, modes of connecting residents to safety, and all the other kinds of pieces that come to play in these projects. So I'll say thank you now. I noticed a few questions maybe start to come by in the chat window. I will happily take more questions. Give me a minute to just read what's come through.
And I'll just say thank you very much, Chris. This is actually a very interesting webinar because what we're doing here as Georgia Smart is trying to get experts to spread their knowledge out into the community to engage people in just the kinds of ways, Chris, that you're talking about. So we're trying to bring everyone to the table with these ideas and get all the stakeholders involved so that it's not just the experts sitting around making decisions without everyone else having a voice in those inputs. So this is, I'm really excited about the things that we're doing here at Georgia Tech and the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge and how we're trying to engage communities throughout the state to really have their voices be heard in this new smart communities area.
Great, thanks, Greg. So Martin, to your question about the safe cycling commutes, we've absolutely talked about ways to use those data to provide kind of profile appropriate suggestions to where to ride. The reality actually is that folks like Google already do this in a better way, and one of the challenges in building out these kinds of smart city technologies is that from a research perspective, we're always in a bit of a race and a competition with what's already happening in the consumer sector. So everyone's using Google Maps or Waze or whatnot. It's much harder to maintain a sustained user base around a small research app that may be buggy. I mean, not that I write buggy software, but these are the kinds of real challenges around these smart city projects. Is that, you know, on one level, I think there's an inclination to say, oh, let's make an app, but the real question is who's going to maintain that, and how are people going to maintain their interest in it? You know, one of the things that I come back to is an early aspiration of digital democracy was to say, look, people have to make choices in how they spend their time. So, you know, you may not be able to go to that 6 p.m. public meeting because you've got to run and pick up the kids, or you're working, or you're just tired, or you have some other obligation that you're dealing with. And, you know, digital democracy's response to that was, well, if it's online and it's digital, then it's no longer bound to that 6 p.m. evening meeting. And that's useful. But I also think that if we look at the kind of smartphone as a vehicle for doing some of these data collection and outreach programs, what you end up with is your smartphone also has to be volunteered to do things. And so maybe you don't want to use the Cycle Atlanta app, you would rather use some other app. And so in all cases, we're having to make choices about how we use our resources. And sometimes that resource is time, and sometimes that resource is, you know, the computer in your pocket. And so thinking through some of those trade-offs is something that we're still having to do.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to give everybody a couple more minutes to submit any questions that we have. But if we don't receive any additional questions, then we will end today's webinar a little early. So again, I'll give everyone a couple minutes to get their questions to come in. Chris, I'll just ask, is there one thing kind of that they could start with that would help communities to start promoting a more digital inclusion in hearing from their constituents?
Oof. I don't know if there's one thing. I think, what do I want to say about this? So not knowing the detail. So I think part of this answer is going to come out in complete ignorance of the history of what each of you have been already doing, with the assumption that you've all already been doing some things. But I think that engagement piece is really important. And I think the engagement around defining the problem is the part that is often the most difficult and the one that doesn't happen. I think oftentimes engagement comes once the problem has been decided by some means, and then you're out talking with people about, capital T, capital P, the problem. And I think if you can back it up a little bit and bring together a working group that says, okay, what is the problem, right? How do we think about it? And this is what came through with the community engagement playbook project, because initially the city had a really clear idea of what it thought the problem was. But by stepping back and working directly with different constituencies across the 5 neighborhoods in question, we were able to shift this problem space a little bit in a way that reflected the needs and desires of those communities, which led to an outcome that was much more meaningful. It was meaningful to the communities, but it was also something that was very useful for the city. That playbook is still being used as in a training module across the city of Atlanta for different parts of the organization that are really engaged in public-facing work. And so it's not a perfect document by any means, but it becomes this longer-lived shared understanding around which both kind of the officials and people whose job it is day in, day out to develop policy and to interact with the public, and the public to have a shared language around what are our expectations of each other, what are our obligations of each other, and how do we meet in the middle.
We had one more question come in so far.
So let's see, the question is reiterating the overall goal and expected outcomes of my efforts. Well, so I think, the goal with the Cycle Atlanta project was to develop 2 things. One was this new data set that would help inform planners, and the other was new forms, kind of experiment with new forms of participation in that process. And I think we did that. Our initial expectation was that the data would be used by planners in the planning of new facilities. But what we realized is that those planning processes are a long time in the making, and the data was actually much more useful as a way to show latent demand once new facilities that had kind of been in the pipeline came online. So it wasn't that planners were saying, okay, we now know something we didn't necessarily know, and we should shift where we're going to build this new bike lane, 1 street over or something like that. Instead, it was, well, hey, once this bike lane opened up, look at all the people that are using it, and look at the parts of the city that are now connected through origin and destination that weren't connected before. And that became a way to then argue for continued or additional funding to keep building out bike infrastructure in Atlanta. With the engagement piece, that was really to build this layer, this set of principles that could be used to help met the bad expectations and history between the city of Atlanta and the 5 neighborhoods on the west side that were part of that process. But also the goal was really to then identify areas to build different kinds of experimental systems that would help the city enact the best possible versions of those engagement processes. And the example that I will give is I have a PhD student now who's been working with the Office of Immigrant Affairs to to think through different kinds of technology solutions that will help them manage their outreach process, recognizing that working with immigrants in the city of Atlanta is a very fraught population. It's difficult in terms of the trust relationship that many immigrants have with the city of Atlanta and with the government at large, for reasons that should be. But there's also a real need to do the work to mend those relationships and keep track of what kinds of interventions are working and which areas need to have additional attention paid to them. And so the playbook became a way to start to anchor that conversation, and then, from that anchor point, build a set of technologies that are experimental to help test some of those ideas. So the next question from Tom is, does the engagement model consider regional characteristics? No, and I think that's actually one of the appeals from my perspective of working with all of you on the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge, is that if I look at my research trajectory, it's kind of gone from neighborhood scale, actually, almost, like city block neighborhood scale to kind of collection of neighborhoods to citywide, but that's really where it stopped. It's been really focused on the realities of, the realities and histories of Atlanta. Thinking about what do these kinds of things look like at the county scale or at a regional scale where you have multiple different kind of administrative boundaries, coming together. What are the things that you need to do that enables those boundaries to be crossed effectively, recognizing that residents may be aware or may not actually care whose responsibility something is. They just want an issue addressed. But the reality of whether or not that's Fulton, City of Atlanta, Fulton County, or is it DeKalb, or how do those things come together, and how do you manage that? Let's see, measuring effectiveness of infrastructure work. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so that looks like all the questions that have come in. We really thank everyone for attending today's webinar. If you do have any additional questions that you want to ask Chris, his email address is at the bottom of the slide, and you can email him if you think of something later that you want to ask. So again, thank you so much, Chris, for being here today for the Georgia Smart webinar series number 5. And we all thank you for attending. Again, we will have future webinars with different Georgia Tech professors talking about a variety of different topics. Those are available, the topics and the professors and the dates are available on our website. So we hope that you attend those in the future. And again, thanks everyone. That's out here. Thank you.